Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Gillian Aarons and I'm the Programme Manager for Adverse Events. So today we're going to be going through the steps of the Significant Adverse Event Review process, which is more commonly referred to as the SAER process. Now, as you know, things can and they do go wrong sometimes, and when this happens, we want to report it as timely as possible. Adverse events are reported through the DATIC system, and depending on how serious or significant the event is, the appropriate severity is selected to reflect it. Most significant events are recorded as a Category 1, with serious events being recorded as a Category 2 moderate, both of which will have a review carried out. So, looking at the steps of the process for these events. So an adverse event occurs within the hospital. As it's a significant event, a briefing note document is completed. Now, this document is what you use as your communication tool, which is used to alert the relevant senior management of the event and to include specific questions to be answered, just to ensure that there is as much detail as possible about the event is captured onto it, as this allows for a more timely and easier decision making for the Commissioner. Now we'll go into the more detail on the briefing note in the coming slides. So this briefing note is completed and then it's submitted to the appropriate senior management and commissioners to review the details of the event and consider which type of review would be best. It can result in the decision for an SAER to be commissioned or a briefing note review, or it could be there's no need for any further review required and the briefing note may be sufficient. If, say, an SAER was commissioned, a review team would be selected to carry out the investigation and it would commence. The locally agreed timescale for completion of the SAERs is 90 days, which can be challenging for some reviews, depending on what's actually occurred. For example, it could end up being a joint review with another hospital or even another board, and this can lead to a longer timescale for completion. So when the review is complete and the review team have compiled the report, this is then submitted to the relevant Commissioner for approval and sign-off. And a copy of the final report is also shared with the family, unless they have indicated a preference not to receive this. So from the recommendations within the SAER report, these are then transferred into an action plan, which is monitored and updated accordingly as the actions get completed. Now, should there be any learning from the review that other specialties or acute or primary care could benefit from, it's recommended that these are shared where possible. Now, sharing the learning can be the difficult part of the process, although we do have the Adverse Events Bulletin, which is a vehicle that can be used to try and support this shared learning. And we have an SAER toolkit, which is available on the Adverse Events webpage via Firstport. Now, this can also help to give you some support if you're involved in participating in a review. The toolkit includes all the relevant documentation that's required, plenty of guidance, checklists, some tips and suggestions, just to keep you on track and manage the review. Now, the list on this slide just gives you an idea of what's included, although there are many more documents within the toolkit that are very useful and can be used. So the language used within the world of adverse events. So we're looking at category of event. Now, this will only describe the harm, for example, death, permanent harm, significant, serious, etc. So the type of review used to carry out the investigation of the event, the highest level of review being your SAER. SAER criteria. This would be if it's a Category 1 or possibly a Category 2 moderate adverse event, then this would meet the criteria for an SAER to be considered to be commissioned. Duty of candour. This can be known at the time of the event, although sometimes you may not know, and it takes the full investigation to establish if it does trigger the legislation for the duty of candour. And causation codes, these are what is known as outcome codes. Again, these may be known, it might be known at the time of the event, or it might not be until the investigation has been carried out. Duty of candour can either be organisational or professional. Now what we're referring to here is the organisational duty of candour, where you've got a patient who has suffered serious harm, and it's as a result of an adverse event where the organisation has been responsible. But please don't get it mixed up with the professional duty of candour. Therefore, for an adverse event to trigger the legislation for duty of candour, there needs to be significant or serious harm that should have been prevented or avoided. The list of definitions on this slide here are highly likely to be investigated as an SAER. And if all the duty of candour events are investigated as an SAER, then all the requirements of the legislation will be met, as this falls very naturally into the SAER process. Causation codes, as mentioned before, these are what we call as outcome codes. Now we've got 1 to 4. So number 1 is where everything to do with the care of the patient was carried out appropriately, therefore the outcome was unavoidable. Number 2, there could be some issues with the care, but these didn't affect the outcome, therefore they didn't contribute to the event. Number 3, this is where there have been issues highlighted that we may have caused the harm, therefore a review would be helpful to determine this. Number 4, again, issues highlighted, but this time it's where we did contribute to causing the harm. Now these codes can be really helpful to conclude if the event could have been avoided or not. So for causation codes 1 and 2, these would not trigger the legislation for duty of candour. But for codes 3 and 4, these can trigger the legislation, and more so code 4, where we did contribute to the harm. So looking at some decision questions. Now, here are some questions that can help you make the decision and determine whether the event was avoidable. All these questions are included as part of the briefing note document, and this is to help gather as much information and detail as possible about the event, so it can help with the decision of discovering whether it was avoidable or not, and did we cause the harm, did we not, and also what type of review may be appropriate for this event. Okay, so moving on to the briefing note. Here's a copy up on this slide. Now some of you may already be familiar with this document and may have had experience of completing or submitting one. So let's go through the sections. So looking at the incident details section, which is quite straightforward. This is just asking for the CAI number, if it's available, and the details of the patient outcome. Then we go on to the brief summary of incident. Now this is based on your typical SBAR format, is what we would say, which should be a concise report of the event, providing details of what was the situation, some background, a bit of an assessment, and some recommendations. So looking at the first part, so the situation, this is where you would want to include all the details that will provide information on what's happened with the incident, what has occurred, who's been involved, where did it happen, and to include any specific information or detail you may have that you think is relevant to this incident. So thinking about the background, to give all relevant and appropriate detail about the incident. So for example, if it's relevant, if you think it's relevant for the patient's previous medical history to be included, if that would help give a better understanding about the situation, then please include it. And looking at the assessment, so this is where you want to start looking at and providing the detail of the injury. For example, has it resulted in significant harm, or has it resulted in a death, perhaps? And for the recommendations section, you should be thinking about what actions may be required following such an event. Perhaps to improve a process, to prevent this sort of incident occurring again. But also, take the opportunity to include whether you think an SAER might be appropriate, that the incident may need a full investigation carried out. But please be mindful, this should be a concise report of the incident, but to include enough detail for the Commissioner to assess the situation and make the decision of whether an SAER should be carried out or not. Okay, so next part is to look at the assessment questions, which we've mentioned earlier on. So we have all yes, no and unknown options for these questions, which make it very straightforward to answer. And if there are questions where you've answered yes, or indeed if there are any unknowns, then please consider this should be given a full SAER. So we're looking at the outcome of decision. So when all sections and the questions have been completed, the next step is for the briefing note to be submitted to the relevant Commissioner to assess and make the decision of which type of review to commission, what would be appropriate for this type of incident that's occurred. Okay, so this is recorded onto the briefing note alongside the date. You'll see we've got the options of an SAER commissioned or a briefing note commissioned and the dates that this decision has been agreed. And if the causation code is known at the time, this can also be completed. And these codes are included a bit further down on the page, just for some reference. And due to candour, again, if this is known, it can be recorded, but if not, not a problem. There is an option for a not yet known, which is absolutely fine at this stage. But as mentioned before, sometimes it can be at the end of the review before this is evident and known. So if it's an SAER that's been commissioned, what we ask for is to ensure that there is an electronic signature entered to show who is involved in the decision making of this. The briefing note is then uploaded onto Datix and the system updated accordingly with the information to show that an SAER has been commissioned, when and by whom, and the review can now commence. Now, should it be a briefing note review that's agreed, you can continue to use this briefing note document as a report template for the review, but it's essential that as much detail as possible is recorded, as well as all the questions answered on the briefing note. And you may want to include other details or information and have additional pages included on it, which is absolutely fine to do. And when it's complete, this document can be accepted as the report for the briefing note review, which then gives us evidence. It provides assurance that a review has been carried out, and a copy of the final signed report is then uploaded to the system, and the close date is entered onto the system also. So overall, on the briefing note, there's plenty of prompts and guidance to keep you right, but it's just making sure that we have as much information as possible captured onto it, and at the end to make sure that there's a signature on it to say who's made the decisions, and get it attached to Datix, uploaded along with the relevant information. And this gives everyone the information required for reporting purposes as well. So thinking as well around the decision making, so another prompt for decision making are these 3 short questions that you could ask as well. Harm or no harm, avoidable or unavoidable, and did we cause the harm? And if the answer is yes to all of these, it's highly likely that this is going to trigger legislation for duty of candour, and an SAER is likely to be commissioned for the investigation to be carried out. Now, what doesn't help with any decision making is when your status can be related to as being in the halt mode, which is meaning you're either hungry, angry, late or tired, or in fact if you're all four of these, that's really not a good state to be in to be making any decisions. So that brings us to the end of the session, where we've looked at the key steps of the process, the SAER process, the adverse events language, causation codes, and we've also touched on some duty of candour and decision making. Now, we also have other sessions that cover ways to communicate with patients, relatives, and techniques for these types of investigations. So should you have any questions in relation to any of the slides that we have covered, these can be submitted to myself or any of the staff from the adverse events team, who are all on the global email address book. So here is your chance to meet the team, as I say, to put the faces to the names. So we have Andy, who is our facilitator within the team, and Vicky and Alicia, who are our coordinators, and we also have Flora, who's the assistant within the team, Karen Cormack, and also our head of assurance, Laura Drummond, who would also be happy to be contacted. We'd like to say thank you for listening and taking the time to come along today. We hope you enjoyed the session and it was helpful, and hopefully there's something that you can take away from this and use whenever you may be involved in an SAER or a briefing note review. Thank you again.